They called him just her black stepfather. They laughed at his shoes, whispered behind his back, but when Lena started crying and his name echoed from the stage, their smirks vanished. The late afternoon sun poured golden light through the high windows of the university auditorium, casting long shadows across polished floors and ivory linen-covered tables. It was graduation day, an occasion meant for celebration, for closure, for beginnings. But for Lena Harper, the joy was laced with tension. She walked slowly through the reception hall, diploma in hand, her black heels tapping softly beside a pair of well-worn dress shoes. Beside her stood Malcolm Harper, her stepfather, a quiet man in his late 40s, his deep brown skin contrasting with the pale sea of white faces around them. He wore a slightly faded navy blazer and khaki slacks, the tie she had helped him pick out that morning sitting a little askew. There was no flash to his presence, but there was a warmth in how he looked at her, pride that needed no words. Lena adjusted the gold tassel on her cap. Her posture was straight, her eyes scanning the crowd, but she felt the shift in the air before she even saw them. Her mother's side of the family, the Crowleys, stood near the refreshment table, all pearls in posture, clutching glasses of sparkling cider like props in a play. The whispers began as soon as she approached, as if the air carried their voices straight to her. "Is that the driver she brought? I heard he was just her stepfather, only married into the family." She could have brought someone respectable at least. Lena's stomach tightened. She glanced at Malcolm. His expression hadn't changed. Not a twitch, not a flinch. He looked straight ahead as if the judgment wasn't for him, as if it slid off without reaching the skin. But Lena knew better. She saw the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly, how his hands remained in his pockets, fingers fidgeting. Her mother hadn't come. Another year, another excuse. This time it was too far, though the flight from Connecticut was barely 2 hours. But Malcolm, he'd driven 7, straight through the night. No complaint, no pause, just to be there. And still here he was, treated like a shadow instead of a father. Lena stayed close to him, resisting the urge to snap back, to defend him. To say this man helped me survive my teenage years when my own mother gave up. But instead she smiled tightly and moved to greet a professor, dragging Malcolm with her. Not because she was ashamed, but because she didn't trust herself not to cry. He didn't say anything about the looks. He never did. But as they passed, a table where a Crowley cousin made a show of shifting her handbag to the far side of her chair, Lena's hand reached for his elbow, anchoring them together. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because neither of them were going anywhere. The sound of laughter drifted from one corner of the reception hall, polished, polite laughter, the kind that filled silences without meaning much. But for Lena, one sharp phrase cut through the noise like glass on tile. "I wonder what her real father would think." She froze mid-step, her grip on the edge of a dessert plate tightening just enough to make it creak. Her shoulders stiffened. Her breath caught. Malcolm, who had been silently admiring the graduation banner stretched across the stage, turned to her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. Gently, his calloused hand reached across the table and touched hers, grounding her. His touch was soft, light, like a bookmark slipping between pages. But it pulled her back to herself. And then came the memories. Not in words, but in snapshots that played behind her eyes like flickers of light. She was 10 years old again, standing on the edge of the school parking lot, her classmates pointing and laughing as Malcolm pulled up in an old, rust-stained pickup with the passenger door that groaned every time it opened. The other parents drove shiny SUVs, wore tailored suits and silk scarves. But Malcolm, he wore a uniform shirt with grease stains on the collar, his hand still marked from a long shift at the mechanic shop. "Is that your uncle?" One kid had snorted. "Looks more like a delivery guy." She had wanted to disappear. Then, she remembered sliding into the seat without a word, staring at the floor. But Malcolm had just smiled, offered her a paper cup of hot chocolate and said, "Tough day?" He didn't need her to explain. He just knew. Then there were the science fair nights. The living room turned into a chaos of wires and colored papers, Malcolm poring over instructions like a college student studying for finals. Even though he'd never finished high school himself, he'd cheered louder than anyone when she won third place, and then fixed her nightlight when they got home. She remembered the first time he read To Kill a Mockingbird to her, his voice soft, steady, careful not to skip any words, even when his eyes moved slowly across the page. He'd sit through violin recitals, even when she hit all the wrong notes, clapping like she'd just played Carnegie Hall. And the moment that changed everything, her biological father leaving, one suitcase, one lie about needing space, one door that never opened again. Malcolm never said, "I'm sorry." He never said, "I'll try." He just showed up. He showed up the next morning, and the morning after that, and every day for the next 10 years. Parent-teacher conferences, dentist appointments, college tours. Not once did he ask for anything in return. Back in the present, Lena's eyes burned. She blinked them clear, watching Malcolm now, his soft-spoken strength wrapped in a thrift store suit and unwavering dignity. He looked so out of place among the polished marble floors and champagne flutes. But to her, he had never looked more right. She slid her hand under his. "You okay?" she whispered. He gave her a small smile. "You're the one in heels," he said with a wink that made her laugh despite herself. The comment behind her still lingered in the air, bitter and sharp. But Lena let it go, not because it didn't hurt, but because she suddenly knew that the people saying it didn't understand the meaning of real. She looked at Malcolm, and in her chest bloomed a truth she hadn't said aloud in years. He never needed a title to be a father. He just chose to be one. A hush fell over the university auditorium as the chancellor stepped up to the microphone, her voice echoing across the polished floor. "And now," she said with ceremonious rhythm, "we begin our honorary recognitions." The audience straightened in their seats. Cameras clicked, murmurs filled the air. Lena sat near the front row, her posture upright but her heart thudding against her ribs. Her name hadn't been confirmed, but whispers had reached her over the past week. Hints from a mentor, a congratulatory email worded a little too cryptically. Still, she didn't dare to assume. Not today. Behind her, the Crowley family had gathered like a private exhibit of wealth and white linen, pearls, pressed collars, and condescension polished to a shine. Their eyes rarely left Malcolm, who stood near the back wall of the auditorium, alone. He wasn't seated with them. He never was. He stood quietly, hands clasped in front of him, nodding politely to those who passed. His suit, though freshly pressed, was a little too large in the shoulders and slightly frayed at the cuffs. His shoes, well worn but clean, were scuffed at the toes, a reminder of work done, not style worn. One of Lena's cousins leaned in to whisper, her voice sharp and theatrical. "Maybe he's here to clean up after," she said, stifling a laugh. Behind her program, another added, "Seriously, who shows up to graduation dressed like the maintenance crew?" Lena heard it. She heard all of it. Her breath caught, but she didn't turn around. She didn't glare or correct. Instead, her hand rested gently over her lap, the other clutching the program just tight enough to leave faint creases. She looked back at Malcolm. He stood still, his eyes focused on the stage, not flinching, not reacting, because he had heard it too. He always did. The chancellor continued announcing names, each met with applause and flashes from camera phones. Behind Lena, the Crowleys clapped with polite enthusiasm, their eyes flickering toward Malcolm with every mention of a new donor, every scholarship attributed to a recognizable last name. But then the mood in the auditorium shifted. The chancellor smiled wider, her voice warming. "There is one award today," she said, "that we did not announce in advance. A special recognition for extraordinary personal sacrifice, leadership through adversity, and lifelong commitment to community and family." Lena felt the hairs on her arms rise. The whispers behind her quieted. This individual has inspired not only their child, who graduated today with top honors, but countless others in our local outreach program. Their humility may have kept them from the spotlight, but today we make sure they're seen. A beat of silence. Then the Chancellor said the name. Malcolm Harper. Lena's mouth fell open. Her eyes darted back toward Malcolm, and for the first time that day, he looked stunned. His brows lifted. His eyes widened slightly, as if the sound of his own name didn't quite belong in that space. The Crowley row stiffened as one. Lena rose instinctively, clapping before anyone else. Her hands met with crisp, rhythmic applause. Then others followed. Row by row, the room rose. Students, faculty, strangers. Only the Crowley family remained seated, frozen. Malcolm didn't move. It was as if he'd turned to stone. Lena stepped into the aisle, nodding toward him. Her smile trembled, but her eyes shone, and slowly he took a step forward. The man they thought was there to clean up was now walking toward the center of the stage, where a medal, a plaque, and a microphone waited. The whispers had stopped. Now, there was only awe. The clinking of glasses and murmurs of idle conversation tapered off as the dean stepped up to the podium. "Before we continue," she said, adjusting the mic, "I want to take a moment to share a story, one that's never been told in full, till now." The crowd quieted. Phones slipped into pockets, chairs shifted slightly. Even the most distracted attendees sensed something unusual was coming. Lena, seated near the front, leaned forward with polite interest. Malcolm, meanwhile, stood in the shadows near the exit, his hands clasped behind his back. His posture was neutral, but his eyes were fixed on the dean. She began. Nearly 12 years ago, during rush hour, a bomb detonated in the lower tracks of the 7th Street subway station. Panic swept the platform. People were injured. Many were trapped. And while most ran for safety, one man ran toward the smoke. Whispers immediately followed. Lena blinked. The story, it sounded familiar. Too familiar. But she couldn't place why. The dean continued, her voice steady but solemn. This man, with no training, no weapon, no thought of himself, pulled 8 passengers from the wreckage. He administered CPR. He used his shirt to stop someone's bleeding. And when emergency responders arrived, he disappeared without giving his name. A soft gasp rose from somewhere in the audience. Someone muttered, "I remember that story." Lena's skin prickled with goosebumps. The memory started to unravel in her mind. A news clip from years ago. A subway bombing. The term Subway Samaritan had floated through headlines for weeks, but no one had ever found the man. She turned slightly, glancing back toward Malcolm. He hadn't moved, but his jaw was tight. The dean pressed on. He avoided press. He never sought reward. But when we tracked donations made anonymously to the trauma center that treated those victims, we found a trail. And it led us to someone standing in this very room today. A beat. Lena's breath caught. The murmurs had now turned to quiet awe. Some guests exchanged glances. Some sat stone still. The dean looked up from her notes and locked eyes with someone in the back. "And today," she said, her voice warming with emotion, "we're honored to finally put a name to the courage." She paused. For effect. For weight. For history. Lena's heart pounded. Something inside her already knew, but her mind couldn't accept it. Couldn't. She glanced around. Her family was whispering again. But it wasn't mocking anymore. It was confusion, intrigue, a hint of unease. And then, the next words the dean spoke would change everything. The name hung in the air like a bolt of lightning. Malcolm Harper. For a split second, it was as though the entire auditorium stopped breathing. Then came the gasps, quick, audible inhales, followed by a wave of camera flashes, the kind reserved for celebrity moments or breaking news. Lena blinked rapidly. Her body turned automatically in her seat, eyes darting toward the back of the room. There he stood, still in that slightly oversized brown suit, still with those weathered shoes, still holding his hands in front of him like he didn't quite belong. Only now, all eyes were on him. The same people who had whispered and laughed, the ones who had mistaken him for a driver, a janitor, or worse, were frozen in their seats. Their faces were a perfect spectrum of shock, jaws slightly agape, eyebrows raised, mouths trying to form words and failing. Even Lena's smug cousin, the one who joked about him cleaning up after, now stared at Malcolm like she'd seen a ghost wearing a name tag of honor. Malcolm didn't move right away. It took him a second to process the moment, a second to believe they really had called his name. Then slowly, humbly, he began to walk. No swagger, no hurry. Just steady, deliberate steps toward the stage. Lena felt her chest tighten, her throat closing with emotion. Her eyes shimmered as she stood. She hadn't known. No one told her. She had been so sure she knew every reason to be proud of him, but this was something else entirely. People turned to look at her now. As Malcolm walked, some began clapping. Then more, louder, until the entire room echoed with applause, except for the Crowleys, who sat stiff and motionless like a family portrait cracking at the frame. The Chancellor met Malcolm at the edge of the stage, placing a hand over her heart as she gestured for him to come forward. "Mr. Harper," she said into the microphone, her voice warm, reverent. "You are a quiet architect of change. Your years mentoring students, volunteering for night classes, tutoring single parents, and funding programs anonymously through the Community Development Fund. We know. And today we recognize it publicly." Another round of applause. But Malcolm didn't blink at the praise. His eyes were locked with Lena's now. She smiled through tears, hands clasped in front of her, as if holding the moment with her own strength. Malcolm took the mic. He looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces, some cheering, some ashamed, some stunned into stillness. He cleared his throat. "I wasn't expecting this," he said plainly. "I didn't do any of that for recognition. I did it because someone once did it for me." The auditorium went silent. "My stepdaughter is the most brilliant person I know," he continued, glancing briefly at Lena. "And I knew, long before anyone else, that she'd make it. Not because of her grades or awards, but because she gets back up every time life tries to knock her down." A few sniffles from the crowd. Even the photographers paused. "I'm not her biological father," he said. "But when her dad walked away, I knew that little girl needed someone who would stay. That's all I ever tried to do, stay, support, and let her know she was never alone." There was a stillness in the air now, the kind that only follows truth. Malcolm looked down at the award in his hand, an engraved glass plaque with his name on it, and shook his head as if he still didn't quite believe it. "I didn't think people noticed," he said softly, "but I guess they do." He stepped away from the mic, offering a quiet nod of gratitude, and the applause that followed was louder than before, longer, fuller, more meaningful. Back at her table, Lena stood with her hands trembling, not from shock, but from pride so overwhelming it made her feel taller. She didn't care about the stares anymore, not when the whole room had just seen who he really was. The man they had mocked for being just a stepfather was now standing where heroes belong, at the front under the lights with his story finally told. There was a moment, just a breath, when the entire auditorium stood still. And then, from the back of the room, Malcolm Harper stepped forward. No longer the invisible man by the wall. No longer just the quiet stepfather in an old blazer. All eyes followed him now, but he walked with the same calm, humble stride Lena had known her whole life. As he reached the stage, even the dean appeared momentarily overwhelmed, offering him the microphone with both hands, her eyes shining. Malcolm took it slowly. He glanced at the sea of faces. Many looked stunned, some embarrassed. A few were already tearing up. His voice, when it came, was gentle. Not grandiose, not theatrical. "I don't usually speak in front of crowds," he began, offering a small, self-conscious smile. "I never planned to, and I never planned on what happened that day in the subway either." He paused, then continued with quiet clarity. "I was just heading home from work. I heard the blast, saw the smoke, and I ran toward it. I didn't think. I didn't pray. I just moved." His hands trembled slightly, but he kept going. "I saw a boy stuck under rubble, a woman who couldn't breathe, And I remember thinking, if I don't help, who will? There wasn't a sound in the room. I never wanted recognition. I didn't think what I did was heroic. I thought it was human. He looked down, then glanced up again, his gaze searching, landing squarely on Lena. But if there's one thing I'm proud of, truly proud of, it's not what happened that day. A pause. It's raising Lena. Lena's breath hitched. Her eyes burned. She isn't my blood, Malcolm said softly, but she's my heart. I was there when her father left. I was there for the nightmares, the violin recitals, the breakups, the late-night study sessions. I didn't do it for a thank you. I did it because loving her gave my life meaning. He cleared his throat. She was my reason to keep going, and today, seeing her graduate, seeing her shine, I know I did something right. Lena could no longer stay seated. She stood, hands clapping, lips trembling, and eyes glassy with pride. The sound of her applause echoed, and then, like a wave, others joined. One by one, the entire auditorium rose to their feet, even the same relatives, who once rolled their eyes, even the same guests who had whispered behind his back. Malcolm lowered the mic, gave a small nod, and stepped down. But in that moment, he wasn't the man in the weathered suit. He was the hero, the father, the man who showed the world what integrity looked like in action. The air outside the auditorium felt different, not because the sun had shifted or the breeze had picked up, but because something in the room had cracked. Years of unspoken assumptions, smug grins, and backhanded remarks had collapsed beneath. The weight of a single truth spoken plainly into a microphone. Malcolm descended the steps with quiet dignity, returning to Lena's side, her arms wrapped around him tightly, not in a dramatic gesture, but the kind that said, "I see you now more than ever." Inside the reception hall, the mood had turned uneasy. The Crowley family, once positioned like royalty with their flutes of champagne and pearls of condescension, now seemed smaller somehow. Their laughter had vanished, their posture had changed. Whispers were replaced by silence. A few approached slowly, awkwardly. Her Aunt Carol, always the first to judge and the last to listen, stumbled through an opening line. "We didn't realize." A younger cousin who earlier had chuckled about Malcolm's shoes offered a half-hearted nod. "I didn't know," he mumbled, eyes glued to the floor. Malcolm looked at him, not coldly but without a trace of apology. "You didn't ask," he replied, his voice steady. There was no need for cruelty, no need for vindication. Just the truth, offered simply. The same cousin swallowed hard and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No one had much else to say after that. Malcolm turned to Lena. She didn't need to speak. The pride in her expression was louder than any toast. They walked together, past the marble columns, past the stunned faces, past the people who had once labeled him the help or mistaken him for a driver. Malcolm's steps were light. Lena's hand was looped through his arm. Neither of them looked back. There were no more whispers that followed, only silence and the fading sound of their footsteps as they left the hall with their heads held high. In that quiet, even the judgmental learned something. That true greatness doesn't raise its voice. It walks beside you, unnoticed, until the moment you can no longer ignore it. The house was quiet again. Back in their modest home, sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting soft golden rays across the wooden floor. The air still smelled faintly of fresh flowers, remnants from the bouquet Lena had been handed after the ceremony. On the kitchen counter, half a chocolate cake sat untouched, the kind Malcolm always picked up when there was something to celebrate, even if it was just making it through a tough week. Lena stood before the refrigerator, holding two frames. One was a drawing she had made in 3rd grade, crayon lines sketching out a crooked house with a tall stick figure labeled, "My Hero Malcolm." It had hung there for years, slightly curled at the edges, its tape yellowing. The other frame was new, a glossy photo, freshly printed, of Malcolm standing on stage, medal around his neck, spotlight on his face, applause frozen mid-motion behind him. She paused, not out of hesitation but reverence. With care, Lena removed the old drawing and tucked it gently into a memory box on the shelf. Then she placed the new photo in its spot, center stage on the fridge door. A quiet elevation, a subtle coronation. She stepped back. For the first time in years, there was nothing more to prove. Not to her mother's side of the family, not to classmates, not to anyone. Malcolm walked in, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He looked at the fridge and then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "I know," Lena replied, voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted the world to see what I've always seen." They sat together in the living room, the silence between them warm and full. Outside, children laughed in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed, and a dog barked at a squirrel. Life in its ordinary rhythm played on, and yet something had changed, because now the world knew what Lena had always carried in her heart, that heroism doesn't always come with fanfare. It doesn't wear medals on its chest every day. It wears calloused hands, a quiet voice, a steady presence through violin recitals and broken science projects and long nights of doubt. It wears the face of a man who never asked to be seen, but finally was. Heroism doesn't always wear a cape, or come with a pedigree. Sometimes it shows up every day, uncelebrated, until the world finally sees what was always there.